And I do want to remind you that if your camera is on, that everyone in the meeting will be able to see you. And if we, for some reason, start having an issue with our bandwidth, you might want to turn your camera off. It does help with that a little bit. We have kept everyone muted so that there's only one speaker at a time. And during the presentation, you are welcome to submit questions in the chat box. If you are unfamiliar with Zoom, you should have a little bar here, either at the top or bottom of your screen, and where it says chat, a little chat box will come up. You can type questions into that chat box. Everyone will be able to see those questions, and Kat and I will do our best to answer those throughout the presentation if we can. If we don't know the answers, we will be saving those for the end for Amy to answer. Tomorrow, you're going to receive an evaluation form. So please share your feedback with us on the presentation. We're always striving to do better, and also looking for future ideas for topics. So if anybody has something in particular that you're hoping we might cover, that's where you'd want to enter that information so that we can get our fall lineup scheduled here, which will be happening very quickly. So a little bit about New Hampshire Lakes. We are the only publicly supported nonprofit in New Hampshire working for all of the lakes in the state. You can support programs just like this one, our outreach programs like webinars, by making a donation today at newhampshirelakes.org. It's our mission to keep all of New Hampshire's lakes clean and healthy now and in the future. We want everyone to be able to enjoy the beautiful lakes that we have here for much longer than we're around. And to do that, we work with our partners. We promote clean water policies and responsible use and inspire the public to take care of our lakes. And we do that through our programs. We have an advocacy program, so we are active at the State House, helping shape laws that will affect our beautiful lakes. We have our conservation program, which our my assistant host here, Kat Keller, is going to be helping tonight. She's part of the conservation team, and we do our lake host program, which many of us know us by. That's helping boaters stop the spread of invasive species going in and out of our lakes by cleaning and draining and drying their boats. And our newer program is the Lake Smart program, and that's helping homeowners make changes on their properties that are going to also help the lakes. And you can learn about both of those on our website. And you can even take a Lake Smart Start survey on our website as well and start your path to becoming Lake Smart. And then we also have our outreach programs, which bring you webinars like this one, and as well as seeing us out at community events, talking about the programs that we offer, informing the public, teaching our future generations. And I do want to give a shout out to Grapponi Automotive Group. They've been a longtime supporter of New Hampshire Lakes, and we're very lucky to have their support. They've supported programs of ours in the past, and they are supporting the whole webinar series this summer. And I have worked with them personally and bought both of my last two vehicles there, and they're really great to work with. So if anyone's in the market for a new car, I strongly suggest working with them. And we are your hosts this evening. My name is Erin Mastine. I'm the Outreach Program Coordinator. And Kat, she's our Conservation Program Assistant. And your expert presenter this evening, again, is Amy. She's going to give us a great presentation. I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, I will turn it over to her for her presentation.
Thanks, Erin. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. I am going to share my screen. And Erin, can you confirm you can see the screen?
I can see and I can hear you.
Okay, great. And am I too loud or too soft or just fine?
I think you sound great to me.
All right, great. I am going to, let's see. I'm going to stop my video for now just so I don't have any bandwidth issues. But yeah, so this is a presentation about what types of aquatic plants are growing in your lake or multiple lakes across the state. And I'm going to touch on a lot of different things. And I know as the summer goes on and as things start growing, a lot of people have questions about what the identification of a plant is and should it be there. And I'm going to try to cover that in today's presentation. So this is one of my favorite shots showing early growth of aquatic plants in a lake. This is at the southern end of Lake Ossipee looking north, and this is early June, and you can see that we've got some yellow water lilies up here while we still have snow fields up on Mount Washington. So it's just kind of an interesting, I guess, juxtaposition when I'm on a lake surveying for plants and I can still see snow, but it's New Hampshire, so that's what happens. An overview of tonight's presentation. I'm going to start off with some aquatic plant news and updates that you guys may be interested in. And that's going to include both state and regional aquatic invasive plant updates. And then I'm going to go through a whole bunch of slides, mostly pictures, talking about common aquatic plant assemblages in New Hampshire's lakes. And then if we have time at the end, I will go through a quick review of invasive aquatic plants, just so that you have those always on the radar and looking for those as you are out and about on your water body. So for the aquatic plant updates, it seems silly to be talking about drought with all of the rain that we've had in July. But as we all know, 2020, we did have a drought. And then we started the first few months actually of 2021 in a drought still. And that did have some effect on aquatic plant communities. So I will go into a little bit more detail on that. And then I'm going to talk about a new plant of interest, one that we just found in New Hampshire this spring that I'd like to get on everybody's radar in case it becomes a problem. And then I'm going to talk about a pretty scary situation in the Connecticut River south of us, not yet in New Hampshire and Vermont, but in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And I'll update you on that. So starting off with drought and invasive species, many of you last year in 2020 experienced fairly low lake levels, no inflow of water, and that did have some impacts on aquatic plants and the various related aspects of that. So one of the things that we saw was, and I think everyone noticed this, an increase in transient boaters and lake visitors when it's really hot and dry out. People are trying to find water and they just want to spend time cooling off and just enjoying our lakes. So that certainly brings with it the possibility of more species moving around, including invasive species. So that is a risk there. Lower water levels can also lead to invasive species and actually native species colonizing farther out from shore. So when your lake levels are 6 inches to a foot, or sometimes some lakes were a couple feet down, that means that sunlight is penetrating deeper in the water column because you don't have as much water to go through for that sunlight. So that means that plants could be potentially growing out deeper or farther offshore than they were previously. So that's something that you may have observed last year that carried forward into this year. And of course, now everybody's lakes are really high and overflowing. But it might take a little bit of time to get back to normal. And in a lot of cases, that will normalize. But in some cases, plants that have settled into deeper water might just have that foothold to stay there. So that could be permanent in some cases where you have plants that are just a little farther out than they were. Another thing too is that we have the potential for more of the tropical species, particularly invasives, to grow in those warmer waters that we had last summer. I can tell you with the rain that we had this month, our lake temperatures are about 3 degrees cooler than they typically are for the end of July, early August. So our lakes did take a hit in terms of temperature. So they're not as balmy, I guess, or hot as they were before, but it is really good growing conditions when you have really warm water. And then a final thing that you may notice is that when your lake levels were lower, you may have had some creep of the terrestrial plants around the edge of the lake, creeping more towards the shallows of the lake. that itself will take care of itself on its own. The plants that grow on land that don't like to be submersed will eventually die off in a few months, and you'll revert back more to a normal shoreline. So those are just some things that you may have noticed in the last year or season and a half of aquatic plant growth in the state. So now on to the new species. So I was out surveying on Lake Winnipesaukee back in early May, and I was in Picro Cove, which is on the western shoreline of Paugus. And it's a small cove cut off by the main lake by a railroad trestle. And you can still get a small boat underneath the trestle, but it's not actually, highly connected to Paugus Bay. And when I was out surveying for milfoil in that cove, I came across this plant. And this is Houtonia palustris. It is, I apologize, it doesn't have an easy common name. So it is the Latin name. But I saw this plant, and as you can see on the bottom left of this screen, those of you that are familiar with milfoil, the leaves of this plant look a lot like milfoil. And there's actually a cousin of milfoil, it's called mermaid weed, which has these really feathery, bigger dissected leaves. And I thought, I didn't realize that mermaid weed was in here. And I took a closer look at it, and it didn't quite match up with what I know mermaid weed looks like. And then I came across some plants that had these purple flowers on them. And that's definitely not something that mermaid weed would produce. So I had never seen it in New Hampshire before. I looked at the taxonomy books that we use for New Hampshire, and it wasn't in there. So I actually had to reach out to a couple botanist friends and get their input on it. And it turns out that it is a plant that is native to Asia and Europe, and it is not at all in the United States, except in one small private pond in Maine. And then there was also a report of this plant in Connecticut in another small pond. So after a little bit more digging, I realized that this plant is actually sold in the aquarium trade and in the home water garden trade. So it's possible that somebody either dumped a home aquarium in Pickerel Cove, or they had a water garden that they introduced this plant into. I mean, if you look at it, it looks really pretty. It's bright green vegetation and the flowers are pretty. So it's possible. Now, a one isolated location for this plant isn't something to immediately be alarmed about. But then I continued surveying around Paugus Bay, and I ended up in Langley Cove, which is across the bay on the east shoreline. And I found another plant. So two locations off the same bay really did raise my awareness, especially since I survey these coves and that bay every year, a couple times a year, never saw this plant before. So the fact that it was growing very quickly and already spreading really made me aware that this could be an issue. So it's not a state listed invasive in New Hampshire. It's really not on any of my colleagues' radar. So it just sort of showed up. And we determined in New Hampshire, after working with the Natural Heritage Program, that it is a non-native, which we knew because it's from Europe and Asia, and that we are considering it an invasive or a potential invasive. So the good news is that we ended up treating Pickerel Cove for variable milfoil back in late May, and it worked well to control this plant. So I'm going to continue monitoring it, and I'm hoping it's gone, but if it's not, we'll continue to manage it. And then on the Langley Cove side on the eastern shoreline, we had divers go in and hand remove the single plant that I found over there. Fast forward a couple of weeks and into June, I was surveying on Lake Winnisquam, and I found this in a marina on Winnisquam. So it's moving, and boaters must be moving it. I don't know if plants are being moved by birds, but now it's in a second lake. So that's really concerning. So it's one that you guys should really be on the lookout for. I don't expect it to show up in a lot of places yet, but the more eyes, the better on this. So when in doubt, I'm going to ask that you take a photograph of it and send it to me for identification. It's probably not flowering anymore, but you're just going to have that vegetative growth, so that green leafy growth. So take a look at it. It's rooted. Most of this underwater growth most of the green growth is underwater, and the flower spikes come up above the surface of the water. And I should mention the growth that I found in Winnisquam was also hand removed by divers. It was like a big cluster of plants isolated in one location. So that's the update on that. Some of you who are aquatic botany buffs, and I don't know how many of you there are that are out there, but you may recognize the genus Hautonia, which is a feather foil. We actually have a sister species of this. It's Hautonia inflata, which is feather foil, and it is a rare plant in New Hampshire. So it looks very different than this. It has almost like a floating wheel of leaves that have these little arms or stems that are inflated, and it floats on the surface of the water, not connected to the bottom. So if you're familiar with Hautonia, that's why. It's the same family, but a different species. So Hautonia palustris is a plant that we want to know about. And then the regional update on the Connecticut River hydrilla. This one is something that we would like on everybody's radar. We've been introducing hydrilla to everybody when we give presentations for a number of years. And so far, luckily, it has not shown up in New Hampshire, but it is in Massachusetts and Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, New York. So every state around us except Vermont. And it grows 25 feet tall. You can see some of the photographs here. This is on the left, it's a marina on the Connecticut River in Connecticut, and it's completely topped out growth of hydrilla. And then when the plant gets to the surface, if it's fairly shallow water, it will form these big mats up on the surface. And then over on the right-hand side, you can see what the plant looks like out of the water. And for those of you who keep an eye out for waterweed, it looks a lot like our native waterweed. So it's a little tricky, and I'll differentiate that for you as I go through the other slides. But pretty much from the Long Island Sound up through almost all of the Connecticut River through Connecticut at this point, it has hydrilla. And then also in Massachusetts, Agawam, which is a border town with Connecticut, from, if you're familiar with where Six Flags is in Massachusetts, from Six Flags South in Massachusetts. So it's not anywhere near up the New Hampshire border, but as most of us know, when it comes to aquatic plants, they're quite literally a boat ride away. And then going back to this slide, this little tuber here over on the right-hand side is edible, and ducks will eat it, and it can go through the guts of ducks and come out and still grow. So waterfowl are a high-risk spread for the species as well. So my colleagues in Vermont and I, and then our colleagues to the south in Massachusetts and Connecticut, are actively monitoring the Connecticut River for any hydrilla growth and where it is. And to date, we have not found any in the New Hampshire-Vermont reach, but we are looking for it. And then we have a lot of boat traffic coming out of the Connecticut River, hopping over to our lakes. So from the Connecticut River, it could be a very high risk to get into our lakes and ponds. So it is a species of concern for sure. Moving on to a brighter topic, I guess, after those two depressing invasive plants, I am going to go through some of the common aquatic plants in our lakes and ponds. And first, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the plants that are present in just about every lake in the state. And I work on a lot of lakes. I go to several lakes a week, every week from when the growing season starts until the growing season ends. And I observe a lot of plants. I basically stand on a boat all day looking down in the water, mapping plants. So I have some generalizations that I'll share with you about aquatic plant communities in New Hampshire. And hopefully this will help you in your weed watching or lake monitoring activities, just to see some of these plants and where you would expect to find them. And the fact that the plants that I'm going to go through in the next several slides are all perfectly fine. They're native. So hopefully they're welcome in your lake. But some generalizations. There are roughly a dozen plants that are in just about every lake in the state. So that's sort of the backbone or the basis or the baseline for aquatic plant assemblages in our lakes. Most lakes beyond that, have about a dozen or up to a few dozen different aquatic plants in your lake system. New Hampshire actually has about 480 species of aquatic plants, which for our climate sounds like a lot, and it is. But some families of plants have multiple species within them, and I'll show you some examples of that. But yeah, so anywhere from about a dozen to a few dozen lakes. The lakes that are more advanced on the eutrophication spectrum, so the ones that are a little bit older, higher nutrients, not older because all of our lakes are the same age, unless they were man-made, but older in the sense of more nutrients, more organic matter. Those lakes do tend to have higher plant diversity, so a higher number of different plant species. And then the abundance of those plants, so the locations or the sheer number of plants in the lake is more common in those more advanced eutrophic systems. The lakes and ponds that still have really good clarities, low organic matter, low nutrients, those lakes have a little less diversity, and they may be at that 12 species or sometimes less. We do have some lakes in the state that only have a couple different aquatic plants in them, and that's it. So those are some of the characteristics of where you would expect to find more diversity and abundance. And then there are always nuances. Plant populations vary based on water body size, depth, the slope of the bottom of the lake. If your lake drops off to deeper water very quickly near shore, or if you have these extended shelves of shallow water that come off your shorelines. The chemistry of the water body, other factors like that, the clarity of your water body. Is it really tea colored, or do you typically have a lot of sediment in the water column, so you have a higher turbidity? Those things all affect plant populations in lakes. So this is the list of that dozen or so plants that I would say are just about in everybody and in every water body across the state. So I'm calling those the ubiquitous plants. And breaking those down by where you would find them in your water body, you have your, you have your emergent plants. So those are the ones that are closer to shore. So you have typically cattails and Picro Wheat. You have Arrowhead. You also might have arum, which is another arrow-shaped leaf plant, Burred, and then I lump these together because they're very difficult to identify, and you don't really need to identify them down to the species level. We usually lump them as grasses, rushes, and sedges around the lake edges. And then as you move into the floating plant zone, your common yellow and white water lilies, floating heart and water shield. And then we have some pond weeds that just have floating leaves. And then under the submergent plants, you're going to see pondweed show up twice because there are some pondweeds that are completely submerged. And then bladderworts, which are truly a ubiquitous plant. I don't think I've been to a lake that hasn't had bladderwort in it. So to further define aquatic plant zones, just so you have an idea of what's what, starting close to shore in your shallow water. So this is from shore out to depths of about 2 feet or so. And this is all very plus or minus, because some plants will grow really tall, some will grow really short. So again, it's variable. But your emergent zone is this close to shore zone. As you go a little bit deeper, you transition to 2 to 8 feet of water. And that's typically where you're going to find your pondweeds and your water lilies. And then as you move out a little bit deeper, anywhere from 2 feet to 15 feet. And if your lake is super clear, like Silver Lake Harrisville, Silver Lake Madison, Swan Lake, you might have plant growth out to 20 feet or 30 feet, way deep down. You'll have some aquatic plants that are still hanging on down there. Probably can't see them from the surface, but they are down there. So super clear lakes will have deep growth. And if you look at that from a real picture instead of a line drawing, you can see that effect here, where up in the background, you have the emergent plants that are rooted in the lake bottom and coming up above the surface. As you move out a bit deeper, you get into the lily pad zone, And then in the foreground, you have, you can see it through the water, and you can see some of those plants that are wholly underwater. So you can see that mix. And there aren't discrete zones. I'm sure you all notice this. There aren't discrete zones. There's mixing in between these zones. So you have carryover with submersed plants growing under floating leaf plants, and some of your submersed plants growing in among your emergent plants. So every lake has its own aquatic plant mosaic, I guess you could call it, where the plants are growing and how they're growing in and amongst each other. So we're going to start first by taking a look at some of the emergent plants, so the ones that are closer to shore and rooted. So the first set of slides that I'm going to go through are all the ones that I listed as those ubiquitous plants. Then I'm going to go through a section that incorporates a few others that are encountered a little bit more often, but not as often as the ubiquitous plants. So emergent plants, the cattails are just about everywhere. They're not just for marshes, they are also for lake edges. And the cattails are pretty neat. They provide a lot of good functions. They really stabilize the edge of the lake. They filter water as it runs off from land into the lake, and they really help settle some of that turbidity or suspended sediment that's running off the landscape. And they provide a lot of good nesting habitat and perches for for waterfowl that use the plants and use the shoreline areas. So cattails do provide a lot of those functions. Additionally, they take up a lot of nutrients, and in particular, they take up a lot of metals, and they lock them into their stems, but also into their root systems. So they're really good filters. So cattails are probably just about everywhere. This one is a really pretty one. We don't have a lot of color when it comes to aquatic plants. We get a couple whites and a couple yellows, but nothing really flashy. So Picro Wheat is a nice pop of color along the lake edge. This one is in fairly shallow water. You can often find dragonfly and damselfly nymphs attached to them, like the carapaces of them. So when they crawl up out of the water and they hatch out, you will often find them attached to the tall stems of the pickerel weed. So if you're kayaking or paddling through these areas, you can check it out and find the cast off shells or casings of the aquatic insects that are growing in the near shore zone. So they're kind of neat. You might also find, if you have, or should I say, are plagued by Canada geese on your water body, they do like to coast through and nip off the tops of these plants. So you may have pickerel weed without a purple flower on the top. A couple more over on the left, we have Arrowhead. This one you can see in the photo is sort of transitional between water and land. It really does like to grow tucked right up on the shoreline area. And you can see it's got these big A-shaped or arrow-shaped leaves. And then usually right now, this time of year, you're going to see a little stalk that comes up with white flowers on it. So that's pretty normal. And then also Burred. So this one actually has an emergent form that you can see here. So it's rooted and it's standing up out of the water. It actually looks like stunted cattail stems coming up. This plant only gets about a foot tall, whereas cattails will get about 3 feet tall or so. So Burred's get this emergent form. It also has a ribbon-like form that's really lax, and it will lay on the surface of the water and not be erect out of the water. So you might see that too. But Burred has these little burr-like seed heads on it that form usually July, August. So you should be seeing those right about now. And they do produce a lot of good seeds for waterfowl. And then here's the lumping. This is grasses, rushes, and sedges. There's really not, unless you are doing a habitat assessment or doing a waterfowl nesting study, you don't really need to go down to species. We probably have 60 or more species of grasses, rushes, and sedges around our lakes, and they are usually right on that transition area between the wet and the upland area. And most of them have these little brown seed heads on them. Some of the things to think about if you want to see if it's a rush, a grass, or a sedge, the little saying is rushes are round. So if you take a rush and you roll it between your fingers, it's perfectly round, so you can't feel any edges. If you grab a sedge, it's triangular, so it has edges. So sedges have edges, and those definitely have some structure to them. And the grasses are kind of round, but they've got knuckles, or joints, they're called joints. So if you go up, it's like a straight round stem, and then you've got like a knuckle or a joint, every few inches up the stem of the grasses. And then the seeds are very different. And that's how you actually key out the grasses, rushes, and sedges, is to get them when they're in seed, and you key them out with this very painful 8-point font, no photograph text, to go down to the species level. So that's why we typically don't do that unless we really need to. And there's really not many harmful plants in this category, except for Phragmites or common reed, which is very obvious. And I've got some pictures of that later on. So you probably don't really need to worry about any of these. Moving into the floating leaf zone, we have the typical white water lily. These can tend to be a little pinkish every once in a while, but if you're seeing water lilies that are very pink, those are not native. Those are something that somebody introduced. We do not have native pink water lilies in New Hampshire. The white ones are native, and the white ones are very showy. They've got a lot of white petals. The leaves are very round, and they have a V-knot shape. And they're common on a lot of our water bodies. And then I already showed you guys a picture of the yellow water lily when we started the slideshow. Here's a little bit of a close-up. The yellow water lily is actually the first plant to flower on our lakes and ponds in New Hampshire. It's a very early bloomer. It sends up leaves and flowers almost right away. So you can start to see these in early May. And then it takes all the other plants a little while to get going after that. So it's a quick grower. These are more of an oval leaf, and they have this rounded heart-shaped base to them. And then I'm going to switch to another slide, but I want to point out a size difference here. So this little guy up on the left-hand side here, right next to the bigger leaf, is floating heart. And it looks like a little floating heart. So it's much smaller than the bigger leaves of the yellow water lily. And here is floating heart all by itself. It is very common. It's usually mixed in with the lily pads. Again, very small. And you may see a little cluster of root systems hanging off. It actually looks, I don't think I have one on here, but it looks like a little cluster of brown bananas, tiny, hanging off. In the middle of the slide, there might be one here, but that is a way for the plant to pick up gases from the water and use it for photosynthesis. So it's a little adaptation that it has, but that is floating heart. It has little tiny white flowers in usually late June, July. And then water shield. This one is also very common. This one is a little bit bigger than floating heart, but it's definitely not as large as the white or yellow water lily leaves, and perfectly oval. You might see a lot of different coloration. I love these because they have so much color to them, especially as the season goes on. You might have some really red ones to some really yellow ones. And that's just as the chlorophyll, or the green pigment of the plant, gets bleached out. The plants fade, some of them fade and turn different colors. And just like the leaves in the fall, once you start to lose that chlorophyll or the green pigment, you have all the other pigments, the yellows and the reds, showing through. So this is a neat one. It has these little, right smack in the middle of this picture is a magenta pink flower, so that you can see they don't produce a lot of flowers, but they're tiny and they're really pretty if you do tend to spot them. Another neat thing about this plant is that it's super slimy. So if you're out in the lake and you reach down and you grab some of them, the underside of these leaves is just coated with a clear slime. And it's pretty hardy. So just beware. It's not harmful. It's just the plant's adaptation to trying to keep from getting eaten from the bottom by insects. And then this is one of our first pond weeds. I've got all the rest of the pond weeds in the underwater section, but this one doesn't have underwater leaves. This is largely pondweed, and it's really common in our lakes. It has a little heart-shaped base to it, and you don't necessarily need to go down to species level when you're weed watching with these, just knowing that it's a pondweed. But this one, you can tell if you look at the middle leaf, you can see where the stem connects to the leaf, there's a change in color of the stem. It's a little bit brighter than the rest of the stem. So about an inch next to the leaf, the stem changes color. So that's a little key for identifying that. And all of the pondweeds have parallel veins on the leaves. So that's always a good way to tell pondweeds. And I know it's weird to be calling a plant from a lake or pond a pondweed, but it is the common name for a class of plants or a family of plants. So they are the pondweeds or the potamogetans. Literally translated is riverweed, but they're also called pondweeds. And for the floating plants, again, using the term a mosaic, you can see that mosaic here. You have a bunch of water shield mixed in with mostly yellow water lily here. And this is a fairly common image to see on the lakes. So they are tending to mix more often than not. And then moving into some of the submergent plants. So world bladderwort, this is a super close up, but bladderwort, this particular species has leaves that are whorled around the main stem. You can see that in this upper part of the plant here. And you can tell it's bladderwort because it has these little clear or greenish, they look like little globules, but they're actually bladders or little bellies. And here's another picture of bladderwort. This is a large bladderwort, and you can see the leaves are not whorled, they're more alternate along the stem. One of the things that I get a lot is that bladderwort confuses people or misleads them to think it's milfoil. And one of the things that I always say is look at the arrangement of the leaves along a stem. Milfoils, the milfoils of Prince Ern at least, have whorled leaves. And I know I said that the world bladderwort has whorled leaves, but they're not milfoil-like. So for that reason, I want to focus a couple minutes on looking at the bladderworts because they are a really important group of plants on our lakes. We actually have 16 species of bladderwort in New Hampshire. Most lakes have 2 or 3 different species of bladderwort in them. And then they're usually the really common ones. So the world bladderwort, the large bladderwort. And then on the upper right side of this slide, you can see the floating bladderwort and that little wagon wheel or spoke of a float. That's actually the flower structure of that bladderwort in the upper right. So they have a lot of different variation and the leaves are arranged differently. But it is one that is very often confused for milfoil. And it does it to me too. I get confused with it if it looks very milfoil-like. But just some of the key things with the bladderworts, they have leaves. So on the bottom left, they have leaves that are more of a branching pattern or a split pattern, where the leaf comes out and it splits. And then an arm of that will split again and split a couple of times. So all the bladderworts are like that. All of the bladderworts also have little bellies on them or bladders. So they could be green or black or white. Some of them are tricky. So over on the bottom right, this one often gets confused for new milfoil growth. It's actually the same plant as the one on the bottom left and the bottom right. But this one doesn't have bladders on the leaves. It actually sends up a separate stalk with bladders on it. So it can be a little tricky. So you always have to look at the shape of the leaves on this one. And then doing that a little bit more closely, you can see in the upper right of this slide, this is a cross section of a milfoil stem. And the milfoil leaves are very feather-like and they're whorled around the stem. And then I've got a couple cross sections of bladderwort leaves here so that you can see that they do split. And some of them are tricky, like those 2 middle pictures right there on the bottom. They do look like they are feather-like, but if you look at the way the leaves are shaped, they split and they split again. They're not branched out like a true feather. And then the bladders are a dead giveaway. over on the bottom right is that intermediate bladderwort again, and you can see that you've got the stalk of the stem, and then you've got a separate stem and it's just bladders on it. So you can see how that branches off and how it looks a little bit different than the others. So bladderworts can be very tricky. I encourage you to send stuff in, but they are native. Bladderworts are not rooted. Sometimes they do tend to stay close to the bottom and look like they're rooted, but they're not. They're free floating. So they also photosynthesize like normal plants, but they do eat microscopic organisms in the water column with those bladders or bellies that are on the plant. And they will eat microscopic things like zooplankton. I've even seen them eat tiny fry, fish fry, like young of the year fish. And I've also seen them engulf one of those little red water mites that sometimes are seen mixed in with aquatic plants. So they are voracious eaters, even though they're tiny. They will try to latch on to anything that swims by. And if it's just too big, they can't get it into their opening. But if they can, it's a goner. So moving on to a few more of those pondweed species. And I know a lot of folks have reported pondweed growth this year. The pondweed on the left is snail seed pondweed, and this is a good way to show scale. That's as big as the leaves get. So it's tiny little leaves that are on the surface. And then underwater, you've got a little bit more growth. Actually, ignore the one on the right. I was supposed to delete that one because I put it in with the floating leaf plants. It doesn't have any underwater leaves. So we're going to just move on to the next slide on that one. Here is the pondweed that gets everybody worried. It's a very large pondweed. It's called bassweed, and it can grow 5 or 6 feet tall, sometimes 7 or 8 feet tall. And it forms these big masses. It does have some floating leaves up at the surface, but most of the growth is these big brown curly leaves underwater. And it is not at all harmful. It's not an invasive. It's just a large manifesting pondweed. It is excellent for fish habitat, so it's a really good one to have. And most of the time you're going to notice this one as you go out to that depth break where you're shallow, and all of a sudden you start to like slope on the lake bottom and drop a little bit deeper. It loves to hang out right along that depth break on the lake bottom. This one seems to be very common this year. I've had reports of it from southern lakes like Cobbett's Pond. I've had reports of it in Lake Winnipesaukee and a bunch of other lakes in between. This is clasping leaf pondweed. It typically has a white stem and it's got this little lettuce-like leaf that's attached alternately down the stem. If you look at the picture in the bottom right, you can see why it's called clasping leaf pondweed. The leaf kind of hugs the stem or wraps around the stem. Very native. It does tend to grow a few feet tall, and you can see it does reach the surface, and it produces little seeds that stick above the surface. So clasping leaf pondweed seems to be kind of common this summer, but not harmful. Ribbon leaf pondweed. This one has almost like a feather frond look to it, and they're very limp leaves. They grow about 5 or 6 inches long, alternate on the stem, and they also have some floating leaves. So this is a fairly common one in lakes. And because they all have to look alike to some degree, this is a different one that looks like a feather frond. This one is often very deep in the water column, and it doesn't really grow more than what this looks like. It's about 1 foot tall, and it looks like a big ostrich fern or feather frond. And sometimes it can get really thick on the bottom of a lake. Other times it's just scattered like you see here. So Robbins pondweed. And then grassy pondweed. This one is also fairly common in a lot of lakes. It's got more of a browner type of leaf, and it's shorter than the one that I just showed you, the longleaf pondweed. It's more of a shorter cluster of leaves, and it also has some floating leaves on the top. But this one, compared to others, tends to be a little bit more browner in color. So those are the ones that we tend to see everywhere. And like I said, for the pondweeds, for the bladderworts, most lakes have 2 or 3 different species of bladderwort. And for the pond weeds, most lakes have maybe four or five species of the pond weeds. So those are fairly common, probably two of the more common plants in the state. So looking at some of the other ones that you might encounter, Pipeboard is fairly common. This one is typically in sandier soils, not really mucky soils. And in this picture, it's really short, but in lakes that are pretty clear, like Silver Lake in Hollis or Madison, Winnipesaukee, Squam, Newfound, this plant can grow 2 or 3 feet tall. It'll have little roots down, not roots, little basal leaves, spiky leaves that look like astroturf on the bottom, and then it will send up a stalk of varying lengths with this little white button-like tip on it. Water lobelia, this one's pretty. It's a pale purple flower. It looks like little nodding flowers along the stem. This one also is an indicator of good water quality, and you can find it in the near shore zone. So it's definitely an emergent plant. This one could be emergent or submergent. So if you are seeing a lot of what looks like grass growing on the lake bottom, it's probably grassy spike rush. If it becomes emergent and comes out of the water, you'll have a little seed head that forms on it, sometimes, not always. And then if it's underwater, it's just going to look like grass. So grassy spike rush is one of those really common underwater growth habits. Here's a little splash of color. I'm starting to see this come into lakes a little bit more often. We have a ton of smart weeds that grow along our roadways and in generally disturbed areas, but this is one of the prettier flowers in a lake. It's nice. It's a nice pink color, and the leaves float on the surface, and it creates these little stalks of flowers that come above the surface of the water. So that's smart weed. It looks a little bit like a pond weed, but the veins are not parallel. And then we have native milfoil. We actually have 6 species of native milfoil in New Hampshire. We have this one, which is the more common one, and it tends to be more of a brownish or reddish color, and it is down really low. It only grows about 6 inches to a foot tall on the bottom, and it's not super big in terms of growth. We have a few other native milfoils that are greener in color that grow a foot or 2 tall. And we also have a native milfoil that grows 5 or 6 feet tall. That one seems to like the eastern part of our state, or the eastern water bodies in our state. So we do have a few native milfoils out there. Aquatic moss, this one grows down low. I apologize, the picture clarity is not good on this one, but there's a penny up at the top that you can see for scale. This is a fairly small plant that grows low on the bottom, typically in the more acidic lakes. So aquatic moss, this one often sometimes gets confused for milfoil too. Folks see this type of growth and they think it's milfoil, but it's just a moss. Water marigold, this one I find in a fair number of water bodies. It looks a lot like an invasive plant called fanwort. The fanwort is a little bit different though, because it's got a main stem, a stem off from that, and then a fan-shaped leaf. These leaves are more circular around the stem. They're branching and they're not on a separate stalk. They're sort of just circular here. So this one's a low grower, but it has a pretty yellow flower if it tends to reach the surface. And those of you who have this and it's reaching the surface now should be flowering. So if you see yellow flowers, it might be this one. And I know we're getting close on time and I want to save some time for questions. So I'm just going to end in a couple of slides. I want to point these out. Waterweed is really common. So this one looks a lot like hydrilla. Waterweed natives, we have 2 species. The one on the left is a broader leaf, a little bit of a broader leaf. And then the one on the right is a bit of a skinnier leaf, and they're both totally fine. They typically grow about a foot tall. Some seasons they can grow 2 or 3 feet tall and get a little bigger. But the leaves on these are in whorls of 3. So if you consistently have whorls of 3 all down the stems, then you're good. If you have leaves of 4 or more consistently, it could potentially be the hydrilla. or another similar lookalike invasive. So leaves of 3, usually we say leaves of 3, let it be, because it's poison ivy. But in this case, leaves of 3 is actually really good. And then over here on the right is a plant that looks a lot like these, except it's opposite leaves. It's completely opposite, not 3 leaves. And that is hedge hyssop. And you guys will find this one in the really shallow sandy soils close to shore. And if the plant actually gets tall enough to get out of the water, it will produce these little yellow flowers. So that is hedge hyssop. And then water naiads. We have a couple different species of water naiad. They're natives. We do have an invasive water naiad, which is one that we want to look out for. Those have very distinct teeth on the edges of the leaves. The native water naiads have smoother leaves. So they're fairly small. They're also called water nymphs. And you can see a coin here for scale. So they're low growers, maybe 6 inches tall on the lake bottom. They do tend to fragment easily. So you could see pieces of this floating around your lake. So that is probably a water naiad. So for those of you who are interested in finding the list of plants for your lake, most of our water bodies that are greater than 10 acres do have a list of plants and a plant map, because we've done a survey on your lake. And to find your lake's map, you can go to the DES Lake Mapper app, and you can just simply go into your search engine and type NHDES Lake Mapper, or later on when you get the hard copy of this presentation, you can click the link and just go right to the page. And what that looks like is once you get into the mapper, you get the map of New Hampshire, you zoom in, and if you pick a lake, here I'm picking Crystal Lake in Enfield. If you zoom in and then you click anywhere on this lake, you're going to get a dialog box that pops up like this. You're going to want to look for the Lake Trophic Survey Report. And in most cases, we'll have a few on your water body. Pick the most recent one. And when you pick that, we'll have a report associated with that. And one of the pages of the report will give you the plant map for your lake. And we'll also give you a list of what all these symbols are. And it will tell you the common name and the Latin name for those plants. So that resource is available to you if you'd like to see what you have. And I bet you that you will have most of those ubiquitous plants and probably some of the other plants that I went through. A few more generalizations about aquatic plant communities. So many native aquatic plant communities are fairly stable. So when you look at those reports for your lake, you're going to see that they're at about 10-year intervals. And many of our lakes haven't been done for 10 or 20 years recently because we lost funding for the program. We finally brought it back. So we'll be updating some of those soon. But you shouldn't really see a lot of changes unless you have a lot of dramatic changes in your watershed where you've got a lot of sediment buildup or nutrient buildup. Aquatic plants tend to creep slowly and they eventually over time take up more space, which is normal, but you shouldn't have a rapid expansion of plants in your lake. And if you do, you should let us know because it could potentially be something that we want to know about. And then also a really big thing is that some of our plants have a boom and bust cycle where they can be more abundant or widespread or bigger one year and then almost absent the next year. And that happens a lot with bladderworts, waterweed, and some of the pond weeds. So don't be alarmed if one plant seems to be going crazy one year because chances are next year it will be totally fine. If you have something in your lake that you'd like identified, don't hesitate to take a picture of it and email it to me. You can take a digital picture of the plant in the lake, but also be sure to take a picture of the plant outside of the lake so that I can get a better look at it. A piece of white paper or paper towel is a good background. And then just email those to me and I'll let you know what they are. I do ask you to hold on to them because we want to make sure that the photograph is clear enough for identification. Sometimes I need to see the plants in hand. So hold on to it until you get the all clear from me with an identification. In terms of management is always a permit required situation. So for any physical or mechanical removal of plants, you would need a wetlands permit. And for any herbicide use, you would need a special permit and a licensed aquatic applicator. So you just can't go in and do management yourself. And where native plants are involved, there are no state dollars for native plant management. We actually don't recommend managing native plants. And with that said, a shorefront property owner, lake association, or other entity certainly could seek a permit to manage plants, but that would need to be paid for by local dollars, and it would need to be still with a permit and a licensed applicator if it's an herbicide treatment. In the interest of time, I am going to skip going over the invasives. As Kat said, and as Aaron said, you have a nice library of webinars from the past, and you can go see an entire presentation on invasive aquatic plants and animals, actually a couple of them, I think, there. So I'm going to end it with that, and I'm glad to take any questions that we have time for.
Okay, Amy, we did have one question. You kind of answered some of this stuff, but someone asked if you are finding that it's a banner year for Bladderwort this year.
You know, it's kind of interesting. I have not seen a lot of Bladderwort this year. With that said, it could be a very localized thing where Bladderwort does tend to become more abundant in one water body, but not everywhere statewide. So the water bodies that I've been surveying on, it's definitely there, but it's not something that I said, oh boy, it's a Bladderwort year. I'm actually seeing that it's more of a waterweed year where we have more Elodea or waterweed in our lakes than we typically do. So for me, from what I'm seeing, it's more of a waterweed year. But you could have a personal Bladderwort problem in your water body.
She's also asking, and you did say almost right after this person typed this question that we don't manage natural plants that aren't invasive. So I'm guessing we would not want to be removing large floating mats of bladderwort. But when an aquatic plant dies and decays, does that increase the total phosphorus in the lake?
It does temporarily, but you have to remember that the aquatic plants are basically recycling nutrients in the water body. They're getting their nutrients mostly from the sediment. For bladderwort, they're getting nutrients from insects, not insects, but microscopic animals in the lake that they eat, and also from photosynthesis. So for those, it's more of a recycling, an annual recycling of nutrients. And the important thing there is that it's good to have a good mix of aquatic plants in your lake because something is going to use those nutrients. And personally, I would rather have plants that would use those nutrients rather than algae, because if you have algae sucking up all those nutrients, your clarity is going to go really low, and you could potentially have cyanobacteria that are using those nutrients, and that could be a potential toxin issue. So plants are really beneficial in that capacity. So I would not worry at all about the plants recycling the nutrients or dying off and liberating those nutrients. It's a natural process, and it's locked up in the important time of the year up in the plants.
Okay. It looks like we have one more question. Stonewort has nodules and not bladders.
Correct. And I apologize. I should have included the stoneworts. The stoneworts are a class of macroscopic algae, so very large algae that copy the look of plants. They're plant wannabes, and they do have nodules. They're actually different structures, but yeah, they're using the nutrients out of the water and the sediments, and they don't have bladders on them. And that's the tricky thing. You got to be aware of the algae blobs and the nodules on the macroalgae, because they could mimic the look of bladders, but they're not really bladders. Even bladderwort has blobs of algae on it that can be misleading. So just be aware of the algae blob, the tiny algae blob.
Let's see, I think a couple more things have come in now. How does bladderwort propagate?
So bladderwort propagates not exactly through fragmentation, but it has a vegetative way of propagating. So let's see if I can get back to that slide. It has a more type of winter bud on it, and it is a tiny cluster of packed leaves. So back on this slide here, if you look at the top left photo, whoops, let me share my screen again. If you look at the top left photo on this screen, you see this almost, it looks like a pom-pom on the tip of the plant. Later in the fall, usually mid to late September into October, the bladderwort will create this little cluster of leaves and then pack it in slime. And that little pom-pom ball of leaves is going to fall to the lake bottom. And that is going to be the source of the new plants for next year. So every individual bladderwort plant will create the pom-pom and then germinate. Over on the right-hand side, you see the flowers. It is a seed producer too. So it will also produce and germinate by seed. But in most cases, that little pom-pom on the left is going to be the source of new plants for next year. But you can chop up bladderwort and it's really not going to cause the problem to the bladderwort growth to continue.
Okay. Who populates the lake mapper?
So we do. So we go out and we do lake surveys and we collect data on the water bodies, and then we create these reports for the water bodies, and then that gets uploaded to the DES lake mapper. So all that information that's out there is from DES typically, especially the plant maps. So those are all ours. So state biologists do.
Okay. It is a little bit after 8 o'clock. So I'm not sure if you want to take any more questions or.
I am completely happy to take questions if they're there. If you have a hard stop, then we can do that too. But I am not in a time crunch. I'm happy to stay on and answer if there are questions.
Okay. I have 2 more that we'll give to you because I think they'll probably be quick to answer. Does the moss you mentioned also grow off of rocks?
It does. It will attach to rocks and it will grow off from rocks. It will also grow just out of the lake sediments too. So, yep, there are probably, I don't know, a couple dozen species of aquatic moss. Some are more common than others, but yeah, they will grow off from rocks.
Okay, and then the last one, how does the current high lake level and large boat waves affect aquatic plants?
Yeah, that's a good question. Boat activity at any lake level will affect nearshore plant growth as you have high energy, big waves crashing towards shore, either from wind or from boat activity. Those waves will undulate and potentially fragment plants as they go closer to shore. So there is a fragmentation spread issue related to that. One of the really interesting things, though, if you have an abundance of lilies in your lake, those big lily pads are anchored to the bottom. So if you have beds of those actually act as energy breaks for the waves. So having the lily pads in the lake, that border, it's sort of like almost a barrier reef, if you will, breaking that energy before it comes crashing on shore. So that's a benefit of some of the lily beds on the water body. But yeah, fragmentation is an issue. Stirring up the lake bottom is another issue, and causing erosion is another issue. But if you have a nice band of plants around your shoreline, you've got emergent plants with roots holding the shore together, you have lilies breaking that energy, and underwater plants protecting the lake bottom sediments, that really does help mitigate some of those impacts that you see from waves of any type.
Great. All right. Well, if anybody has additional questions, we will be happy to take those in the office at New Hampshire Lakes and forward them to Amy if we don't have an answer for you. And like we said, that this presentation will be on the website. You'll be getting some follow-up information from us. And I want to just say thank you, Amy. This was really interesting. I've been on lakes almost my whole life and have always wondered what a lot of these things are and didn't know the answers. So thank you so much for helping us inform the public about these wonderful plants.
Thank you. Anytime. I'm glad to help.
Okay, everybody have a great night.
Night, everyone. Thank you.